A few years ago I met Joaquin Cardenas. He was a fisherman and worker in a salt mine in the Uquil Cerdan Ejido in Altamira, Tamaulipas. I used to go to the Barberina River Bridge to fish and drink beer, watching the fishermen until they caught some fish and shrimp. It was common for us to talk about life in the Ejido and the stories of the people of the region. Joaquin lived in a place near Moron. He was an older man, a bit unsociable, but he had great wisdom and knew many scary stories, which he told me with all the warmth of a beer and some fried fish. Joaquin's stories begin when he was very young. He helped his grandfather on a family plot they had a few kilometers from the town. It was common that, after working the land and harvesting some vegetables, they would count on firewood to take home and have something to cook with. At that time, the houses had clay ovens and grills where the heat from the line prepared their food. Joaquin's grandfather had an old Chevrolet truck, located by the salt and humidity, but it had a good engine. In it they transported their tools and firewood. Every day they traveled a long and rough road to go and return, full of dust and potholes that made the truck bounce, and this caused it to go slowly. Late at night Joaquin loaded the last bundle of firewood, chopped it and began their way back. The sky was starry and there was a full moon. The pairs of the truck barely illuminated the road. A few meters further on it was total darkness. At a certain point on the road, the grandfather stopped here, but today he realized that the road was blocked by a fence, the same one that a farmer had left to fence his plot. There was only one way around and it was by a little traveled road, full of weeds and stones, where the horses struggled. In order to continue on his way, much to his regret, the grandfather reversed and being at the entrance of the road here, he sighed deeply and looked out. Joaquin, surprised by how nervous his grandfather was, thought that he had never seen him like that. He never tried not to think about it and he placed his head on the window to try to doze off while he and his grandfather arrived. Werder, watching the road and driving a little fast as they passed a water wheel, a start from the truck made Joaquin sit up. The grandfather was going very fast along the road, making the engine roar and lifting off the road by the potholes where they passed. "What's wrong, grandfather?" asked Joaquin in bewilderment. "Nothing, my son, big in that, Joaquin." End of a heaviness and a feeling of being watched. An electric current ran through his head and back, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned to see his grandfather and he had his eyes on the road, with his hands gripping the steering wheel and his head almost glued to it. Suddenly he heard something happen, the whine of the truck, and it swayed, as if something had been read with it. When a floor turned to see what it had hit, the grandfather shouted energetically and with all his strength, "No, no, you!" Joaquin moved and turned to the front. The shout and the feeling that they were bringing something behind made his heart start to beat strongly. The truck's engine roared as it accelerated. They were coming quite fast and looking at his grandfather, he noticed that his face was full of fear. Never in his life had he seen him afraid. Suddenly they heard some loud knocking on the rear window of the truck. It was impossible. No one was coming behind, or at least that's what they thought. The instinct to turn around was quickly dissolved by the calloused hand of his grandfather, who grabbed him by the cheeks tightly and stared at him without letting go of the steering wheel and said, "Look at me, you bastard, not the whole test, don't stop looking at me." The grandfather's frantic warning made the old atmosphere here coalesce and stare at the old man, who began to sweat profusely and say prayers. Under his breath, "Help us, Holy Lord, be your name. Do not abandon us, my God," said Joaquin. He heard again the sound of something returning to the sheet metal of the box. It was as if something was jumping on it, but it was impossible, due to the speed and the way the truck was jumping. He stared at his grandfather and did not want to turn around, but out of the corner of his eye he saw a lump in the back of the truck and something moving frantically. He closed his eyes tightly so as not to see and he wanted to cry. He wanted his flight to stop and to keep running from there. Again something was growing on the rear window, something wanted Grandpa to see again. He was on the verge of collapsing, looking determinedly at Joaquin, shouting at him not to turn around and to only see him. The old man's face was one of pure terror combined with desperation and the point of tears. The truck's engine was at its limit, roaring laboriously, and Joaquin thought they were not going to make it out of that place. His heart was beating so fast that, for a moment, he thought it would jump out of his chest. He closed his eyes tightly and he began to pray and ask for forgiveness for everything, and an impulse made him remember his parents. He thought he was going to die, but at that moment the speed of the truck slowed down. He opened his eyes to look and they were already on the main road, which was a path of stones and compacted earth. When he looked, Grandpa was with his head leaning on the steering wheel, breathing with relief and sweating profusely. Everything was silent and you could hear the crickets and cicadas in the woods and the hum of the truck's engine. He started the car and the stones began to crunch. a sign that the main road would take them, which they could already see in the distance. His grandfather told him the following. He told me about what he got and heard. "Don't tell your mother and grandmother or me," said the grandfather with a determined voice. "Yes, yes, grandfather, but what was all that about?" asked Joaquin. "It's a son, it's about him. If you had seen him, he would have turned you all white and maybe you would have died of fright." Joaquin, upon hearing that statement, believed us, but I cannot imagine the terror of his grandfather and what he felt and heard. When he arrived at the house, he noticed that there was nothing in the truck bed, not even the tools or the firewood. They had gotten lost in the jumps, but he could still see something strange that gave him a chill. There were some dents in the pickup bed that confirmed that something had really hit them. There were several, as if something had stepped hard on the sheet metal. "I can't sleep here tonight." His people, who remained outside his window, prayed in silence and in memory. Then, in a salt mine he had known a long time ago, that man was called Felipe. He must have been about 20 years old when he saw him. His hair was completely white and on his face he had some marks from Muñoz. It was then that he related his experience to that of the young man. People said that he had appeared to him one night in a marsh, but that is another story.